Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to come here to talk about my research, and a special thanks to Steve Conway, who saw a write-up about my research in one of the media outlets and told me about this forum. So I'm very glad to be here and to meet everyone. And so I will be talking about rescuing lost history and using big data to recover Black women's lived experiences. And I want to first talk about my research team and collaborators and really stress how interdisciplinary it is. I have faculty and students in computer science. I have humanities, a digital humanities librarian. I have someone who is in English who also worked with big data and the humanities, sociology, African American studies, gender and women's studies. So a really diverse team that was wonderful to work with, and then also consulted with people from the National Supercomputing Center. And so in terms of an overview, I want to talk about kind of my first experience with NCSA at Illinois, and want to encourage you to think about it in terms of workforce development and diversifying the workforce, how the project that I'm going to talk about today got started, the motivation for it. I'll talk about some of the finding, challenges, and lessons learned. And then I was at an Exceed conference a few months ago, and we put together a short paper, and I have 10 copies of the paper, and can also, I'll have a website where the paper is listed as well. So my first exposure, Kevin Franklin from NCSA, he came to African American Studies, and he had this blank sheet of paper, and then this image came alive on the paper, almost like a hologram, but Alec Craig, who invented the technology, said that it wasn't quite. But I was fascinated, I was intrigued, and I said, oh, I want to kind of think about that later in my research. And so just kind of over the years, I have talked with Kevin and others at the Supercomputing Center. Kevin and I and others co-authored a white paper to the National Science Foundation about violence and trying to use big data to capture people's experience with that. We're currently working on a documentary about mothers who lost children to violence, and again, thinking about how to collect big data on that topic. I also worked with Alex, who was at NCSA on a KL1 proposal, and to think about network analysis and when women in neighborhoods with high levels of violence experienced a loss, like how did that affect their neighborhood in terms of who provided resources and who didn't. And then, so Michael Simeone was then at Illinois. He's now at Arizona State. And I invited him to do lectures in my class. I teach research methods and train sociology students and others how to collect data, analyze data. And I wanted them to think about, to have exposure to this idea of big data, right? Like you can ask different questions and get different information. So after our talks, Michael Simeone and I, we would just kind of sit down, and I would say, oh, that was interesting what you said. So if I had this question, can I do it this way? Like, can I use it this way? And it was a really good way to just kind of go into his world for a few minutes, and he would kind of be the bridge. And so that led to me applying for a faculty fellow program. And the first time it wasn't funded, but the second time was I proposed to do a visualization topic models about African American women's everyday experiences and standpoints. And so that's the project that I'll talk about today, where initially we searched through millions of periodicals, books, newspapers, and JSTOR and Hardy Trust, and again trying to identify conversations and what was in the topics in terms of what Black women talked about and what people who wrote about Black women talked about. And so again, the motivation for the study is that often literature by or about Black women is inaccessible. And Alice Walker, we tell this wonderful story, and we actually developed our methods around this idea of call and response. She was looking for Zora Neale Hurston's grave. It was an unmarked grave, and it was out in a vast cemetery, and then she did a call. She was like, Zora, I don't know where you are you out here? And then I think it was an insect, the unusual insect caught her eye, and then led her over into the direction where she thought it was. So as I kind of talk about the methods that we're using, and also in the Black tradition, you see the call and response in Black churches, we try to incorporate some of that in terms of searching this vast data, trying to put out a call, and trying to get back information about Black women and their experiences and challenges and accomplishments. So the research questions are: what themes emerge about African American women using topic modeling? And how can the themes identified be used to recover previously unmarked documents? And I should say that Alice Walker then put a marker on Zora Neale Hurston's grave. So she recovered it and then also made it available for future generations of individuals. And then another question was, how might we visualize the recovery process? I didn't mention it earlier, but one of the members on the team is a specialist in visualization. So just one challenge that I'll kind of talk about now up front is that copyright was a really big deal. Hardy Trust wanted to use our study as a case study between Illinois and Hardy Trust. They wanted to make documents available, but because of public domain issues and looking at publications prior to 1923 and after 1923, there are very specific rules that you have to follow, so that took a while. Although we respected the right for copyright, it did delay the project a bit. And also in terms of challenges, right? So I'm trying to do, or my team, a call and response. So what's the call? What does it look like in terms of big data? And so these are the search terms that we use in terms of trying to capture all documents that have some information about race. We use Black versions of Black, African American, Negro, colored, the N-word due to our history in the U.S. In terms of gender, versions of woman, female, girl, lady, and ladies. And so some examples of what came back when we did a search like this in JSTOR, there was an article called Changing Racial Labels, and it talks about how African Americans went from colored to Negro to Black to African Americans. And then in the Hardy Trust, it was The Crisis. Anyone knows The Crisis, what that was? So it was a magazine that W.E.B. Du Bois edited, and lots of information about Black life and lots of information about Black women and Black families, Black children. We also had information from the Journal of National Medical Association that was specialized to look at research about Black medical care and health disparities, and it started as early as 1909. And then an article about the Negro at work during the war and during Reconstruction, published by the U.S. Department of Labor. So those are just some of the finding, or some of the articles, books, and journals that came as a result of the search that we did. And so just a little bit about standpoint theory. And what it is, it excuse me, it seeks to uncover the pivotal role of knowledge in reproducing and dismantling social inequality. And also it's group knowledge based on shared experiences. So generally Black women in the U.S. have both the issue with race, class, gender, and many other intersections. And so standpoint is the knowledge that they develop based on being in that special social category. And also in terms of standpoint, it really wants to link everyday lived experiences of Black women to these systems and try to unpack how these systems affect their lives, affect their accomplishments and what they do. So in terms of methods, we use LDA, right, to look for patterns of word distributions, both within documents and across the corpus. We also use comparative text mining, looking for similarities and differences among the topics. So you have the common topics, and then you have a subset of variation, and so we broke that subset down into historical periods. So again, we talk about interested in looking at Black women's lived experiences. So we looked at slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow area, civil rights time period. Those are some of the subcategories that we used. And so when we first started out, right, just kind of getting the documents, the team is there, we're trying to talk across our disciplines, and so one of the visualizations that was helpful at that point was word clouds, right, where we would look at the words and try to make sense out of it. And so here's an example where we tried to name the topics. So it talks about court, property, estate, plaintiff, law. And so as a team, we would sit around and say, okay, so what do we think is here? What do we think it tells us about Black women's lived experiences? And so we came up with this idea, a legal battle that was playing out in court. And then the question was, so are Black female slaves taking cases to court? So in this case, we did close readings, and we found out that by 1846, there were actually 575 lawsuits where slaves attempted to get their freedom, and about 60% of the time that they won, right? So that's an interesting piece of U.S. history, and in fact, historians call this the Golden Age. And then, but it was unclear in terms of if the property or estate referred to slaves because they were seen as property, or if it really was about land. And so this is where knowing information about the historical period where these documents are appearing will come into play. And then what we also found was that Sojourner Truth, a big figure in history, that her son was actually illegally sold into slavery, and then she went to court to have him freed and actually won. So again, this idea of looking at Black women's history. And this was good because, again, it was early in the project, and we weren't sure like if what we were theorizing, our research questions, could actually be answered using the methods that we had. So this was a good way to confirm that. So in terms of visualization, so again, we're trying to think about how to look at this data, how to manage it, how to think about connections. And so this is one visualization that Mark Van Moor did for us, where it's network visualizations, and it's trying to show how the topics are connected using Pearson correlation coefficients. And here's another one looking at different time periods, and the dots represent different documents that are there. 1808 was the abolition of slaves being imported into the U.S. Slavery was not ended, but they stopped importing slaves. And then Nat Turner's Rebellion, which was a really big point in history and kind of did a shift, and then Uncle Tom's Cabin in terms of the abolitionist movement was important. So trying to visualize what data do we have during those periods. And then here's what we refer to as a tree map, and this one is based on the comparative text mining, and just kind of trying to understand what's in the common topics, what's in the subdivisions that are based on those historical periods that I discussed. And so here's, when I talked about the call and response, we call it the serve message, a method where we try to search, recognize, rescue, and recover what we find. So again, the search is when we train the topic model, and we used a subset of 20,000 documents that we knew for sure were by or about Black women. And then the recognition involved when we did intensive intermediate reading and close reading, really trying to identify were these new documents by or about Black women, and then if so, after they were confirmed, then we do what we call rescue them and place them into this new corpus of data. And then what we plan to do is to make these documents available to librarians, to scholars, to community members, so that they can search this information, they can have it. So very similar to what Alice Walker did by putting a gravestone on Zora Neale Hurston's grave. And so we also did KL divergence and cosine similarities with the 800,000 documents, again trying to use the 20,000 and the algorithms to see if there were similarities in the larger corpus. And so with cosine, right, the one means that the documents are most similar, KL divergence. Any numbers that were lower meant that it was most similar. And so again, that's one way where we were trying to do the call and then get the response based on the number, and then that would tell us that yes, there may be something in this data about or by Black women. And so our findings, one was that there was quite a bit of missing subject metadata. So when we searched 300,000 documents from Hardy Trust, about 80,000 of those documents did not have subject metadata. And so that's saying, like, if researchers went to look for information about Black women and they didn't really know that the documents existed, then they wouldn't necessarily get those documents if they weren't tagged properly. And then also that writing is an act of privilege. In some ways, it really was a challenge to recover a lot of the documents about Black women's experience. And part of that is due to the history in the U.S., right, where Black women were forbidden, right, through threats of violence, through poor quality education in many ways, from reading and writing and getting their history out into the digitized record. And so that made it hard to recover. And therefore, when looking for their voices, looking for their experiences, we often have to go through others, white women, black males, or white men. And so we did an article looking at this and really trying to argue that when people think about big data, they often think that it's neutral, and that it's not. They have to think about it historically, and they have to think about whose voice is represented in the big data and whose voice is not. And then one example of this was the American Journal of Diseases of Children, where it was physicians who were kind of, writing up their research findings. This was 1980. They talked about black children, but limited references to their mothers who were taking care of them. In the articles, there was talk about congenital complications and infant mortality, diseases, just general health issues. In terms of the standpoints and insights that we could get, information about mothering a sick child, death and grief. There was a lot of talk about the children and how they died, but very little about what the mothers do. Also, the mother's access to medical information for their children. And so one example, a mom brought her 5-year-old son in. He had diarrhea, and he had it for a year. And she just brought him in because she noticed blood in the stool, right? So it's, again, kind of tells us in terms of the length of time that the diarrhea was there, and then there was this trigger of the blood being in the stool, and then also gives us information about social class. The doctors talked about the child being malnourished. They referred the mother to a charity hospital. And then in terms of racial context, how the child was being raised, the doctors also said that the families was farmers, and that's not unusual, right, because of blacks' history in the U.S., and then also reported that the child's diet reflected a typical diet for blacks. So again, kind of information about cooking, about possibly what the mothers told them that the child was eating, what may have caused the diarrhea, and other symptoms. And then there's a finding that was about black women's bodies and medical advances. So there was a lot of articles about black women and medicine, and it kind of talks about the issue of black women in U.S. and the findings associated with many of our medical advances, right? Henrietta Lacks is one of the big examples in terms of her cells and all the discoveries that came from that without her knowledge. And then, so here is example of what I call finding needles in the big data haystacks. So as we use these methods, we're starting to pull out documents that we're pretty sure are by or about black women because of their relationship to the initial 20,000 that I discussed. But again, they were tagged in a way, or something about them would not lead someone to think that they were by or about black women. And so to date, we found about 124 of documents that, again, that were not identified as documents by or about black women using KL Divergence, and then about 26 with Cosine Similarity. And so we're just at the beginning of this process, and it's quite labor intensive in some ways. The machine learning helps us kind of send out the call and response, but then when we try to recognize and when we try to interrogate whose voice is this the woman, is she speaking for herself, or are we going through others, that's labor intensive. And then, so again, as we do this, as we think about these models, we're doing it because we want to encourage social scientists, we want to encourage humanists to think about big data, think about the questions that they can answer, and hopefully what we're doing will serve as a model to different ways that they can answer questions. So a little bit on lessons learned. I talked about the data agreement. In terms of having a group like the one that I had support is really important. So the project was funded by Exceed. And then we also had extended collaborative support services during the latter half of the project. And it really made a difference because, as I said, the research team is very diverse, and that allowed us to continue to come together sometimes twice a month around the table for years to talk about. You know, when we first started, I was like, okay, so topic modeling, so tell me again, right? It's words, it's how the words are associated. These are my questions. How is it answering my questions? So that was really important. And then Professor Zai at Illinois really did a fantastic gesture when he offered to have a grad student work on my project, and she's been there with us for years. So that's a really important resource that we have had. And the graduate student gave me information about computational processes. So as I was listening to some of the conversations, it seemed like this group would be interested in that. So I just tried to put together a few pieces of information. So when she was doing comparative text mining, she talked about that it took 5 days on Greenfield, which is the supercomputer at the University of Pittsburgh, and that she said it took 5 days to create 25 topics and eight expert models for each of those topics. When she was doing inferencing, it was 2 days on Greenfield, and then Bridges is the latest supercomputer that they have at Pittsburgh. And then she talked about how Greenfield used a lot of processing units, so it exhausted the resources that we had, but Bridges lets you define memory needs, and so then that lowered our computing costs. When she was doing parallelization and inferencing, she talked about how it took 1.5 days and how if we use sequential processing that it would have taken 90 days to finish ranking the 80,000 documents that we used. And that the training step wasn't easy, and then that it didn't produce any speed ups since the algorithm had to wait for all of the expert models calculations to finish before comparing them among iterations to check for convergence. And then this chart just kind of, again, gives an idea of the computing hours that we need when we try to run all of the models on Greenfield. It took about 168 hours, about 5,000 SUs or hours in computing time, and actually it was terminated because it exceeded the limit that we had, so she had to break it down and run it one model at a time. On Greenfield, it took about 75 hours. Bridges, the latest computer, took about 81 minutes. SUs, about 2,253, and then with Bridges, just about 77 SUs. So again, the project was initially started to think about Black women, their lived experiences, how inequality is expressed or hidden, right? Because again, the project is to talk about recovering their lost history, their everyday lived experiences, and then also how they seek to change different systems of oppression across historical periods, such as slavery, Reconstruction. I think about Ida B. Wells with her marking down the lynching statistics and being very meticulous in terms of what's happening, how many, what was the argument given, was that the true argument, and collecting those and trying to make an argument to pass laws against the lynching, civil rights era, and now Black Lives Matter, where now we're in the age of technology where everyone can put their thoughts out into the cloud, and as researchers we can get those thoughts and look and try to find out what are people saying, what are people thinking, what's the standpoint, what's the group knowledge. And then this last slide again is about developing a diverse workforce. So Nicole was one of my graduate students when I received the fellowship. I was like, Nicole, she's a Black woman. I was like, I want you to come work with me on this big data project. And she was like, big data? You know, I work in the archives and I do this. And I was like, no, this is going to be interesting. I want you to come work with me. You have great knowledge about Black women, Black feminist thought. And so she came, and now she is doing great, wonderful, fantastic work with big data. And that's also the goal, that I want students in humanities and social sciences to come and to think about this work, these kind of questions, and really be at the forefront of this area. Oh, and then also we're working on another technology to provide universities and industry with information in real time about people of color experiences in the academy or people of color's experiences in industry. And we want to use that data. We're hoping it's national data, big data, to help with recruitment, retention, and promotion. So again, training both undergraduate and graduate students to work in interdisciplinary groups. We want them to design, to build, to use HPC, and to be very fluent with big data. And so my last slide is a slide that's a piece of history that I did not know, and I was kind of surprised when I found out, again, this idea of Black women's history being hidden. And it's a new book that's coming out, and there's an article, and the title of it is How History Forgot the Black Women Behind NASA's Space Race, and talks about and this quote is from the article, in 1940s, a group of female scientists were the human computers behind the biggest advancements in aeronautics. The book is called Hidden Figures, and it's coming, and it tells about their remarkable and, again, untold story. And to the left is a picture of one of the women who is actually involved, and then to the right is an image from a film that's also coming out about it. And I'll just say, like, I have been fascinated with the space program. I think it's amazing. I think it shows humans' genius, but I've never seen a picture like the one on the right side, and I didn't even know like such a room existed. So that's, again, just an example of how important it is to recover Black women's history and also to facilitate people of color being able to record their experiences and their knowledge currently. So thank you. Thank you very much.